Hey pushers, let's go ahead and finish this frame. We're going to continue frame 9, LBJ and domestic policy, picking up with civil rights. So this is going to be, I was talking about in the last video how the 1960s and the 2020s, there are a lot of similarities and then there are also a lot of differences. Yesterday we're talking about women's issues and how different it is. I mean, there's an expectation today that women will make equal pay, that women have legitimate equal rights. The expectation, right? In the 1960s, there was no expectation that women were equal under the eyes of the law. However, we're going to talk about similarities today. So, in recent Black Lives Matter protests that have been out and about, we're going to see a lot of similarities to the civil rights protests of the 1960s. So you can make the parallels. So I'm going to start with voter registration. So voter registration continued to be a struggle. And Alabama, of course, was kind of the epicenter of racial injustice, discrimination, and voter suppression. So in early 1965, again, with the issue of voter registration, Martin Luther King is going to resume his work on trying to get the 1965 Voting Rights Act passed. So after a local preacher was killed in Marion, Alabama, another civil rights activist by the name of John Lewis. You can see a picture of him here. That's him as a young man. He organized a march from Selma, Alabama to Marion, Alabama. And of course, this is over the issue of registration of voters. African Americans were 50% of the population, but only 1% of registered voters. So here, they started their march in Selma, but when they left the African American neighborhood in Selma to enter a white neighborhood, they were here confronted by police. There was some discussion between police and protesters, where the protesters saying, "We're going to keep moving peacefully, we're going to keep marching," and the police were like, "No, you're not. We're not going to allow you to continue, to continue." And so violence breaks out as the marchers continue to move and police attack the protesters. At this point, famously, John Lewis is horribly beaten by police, and as you can see here, police brutality becomes a major issue. So, state troopers did use tear gas, whips, to stop the peaceful protesters. You can kind of see some of the famous images here. Police officers attacked civil rights marchers in Selma, Alabama, who were attempting to begin a 50-mile march to Montgomery. From Selma to Marion, ending in Montgomery. Just to be clear. So you can see police using batons and all kinds of other implements, tear gas, in order to and the protesters did learn, and this was a big part of the 1960s movement. Protesters were taught how to roll up into a ball and take a beating because retaliation was not part of the King vision. Instead, the police brutality, again captured on television, is only going to garner sympathy for the movement, which was kind of the point. And epically, and again, I have already mentioned that LBJ was the most liberal-leaning president to hold the office. LBJ goes on national television in a speech on television in which he says that, quote, "We must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice, and we shall overcome." It was a powerful statement made by LBJ on television because "We Shall Overcome" was a hymn that was often sung, a gospel hymn that was often sung by protesters as they marched. And the fact that a white man from Texas is going to invoke "We Shall Overcome," siding with the protesters, was pretty epic for the movement. So the Voting Rights Act will be passed in 1965. but it also marked an end of an era in the civil rights movement. 19 before From 1965 and before, the civil rights movement focused on nonviolent demonstrations and targeted the South. And leaders were invoked civil disobedience, like Martin Luther King. But after 1965, the movement is going to become more militant, more confrontational. It's going to focus in on the north and western cities, and it's going to be more radical, and it will be more violent. And instead of unification, like it was before 1965, the movement became about black separatism. So, so we're going to see that Martin Luther King at this point became highly unpopular because of this more militant movement. And another one of the evidence to support how 1965 started to become a more violent movement, as it appeared that the pace of the civil rights movement was happening way too slow, which is what is going to anger a lot of African American protesters. So what's going to happen to riots? As you can see here, one of the famous in 1965 was the Watts riots, in which is an African American ghetto in Los Angeles. So we said western cities and northern cities, and this is very similar to what we've been seeing, recently with protesters, uh, and on the one hand trying to remain nonviolent, and then you have the rioters, the more radical movement, and we do see that Watts burned. It rioted for 5 days. Um, Again, the idea was protesting against police brutality. Property was burned, stores were looted, and I always get the question, well, why would African Americans start to burn down, their own cities? And a recent Black Lives Matter protester kind of put it in perspective when she said, because we don't own any of these things. These are not ours. And the system is rigged against us. And so anger, right? Anger has been the result. So not a lot has changed from 1965 to today. Another example of how the movement becomes more radical is a new leader, Malcolm X. He was born Malcolm Little. He joined with the Nation of Islam, which is not affiliated with Islam itself. It's the Nation of Islam. It's a much more militant, American born, highly radical organization that did often resort to violence. And Malcolm Little, unlike MLK, is going to push for black separatism, saying if we need to go violent in order for change to take place, then so be it. Um, he went on pilgrimage to Mecca, and when he realized that Islam was really about peace, he came back and decided to change his tune to move more towards more peaceful resolution. But then he was assassinated by members of the Nation of Islam. And again, violence, whether it was Malcolm X's beginning, to use a more radical approach to his actual assassination. Another example is going to be the Black Panther movement, largely run by Stokely Carmichael. And he becomes more radicalized as well when he was brutally beaten by police after being a peaceful protester. And part of the Black Panther movement is, again, more radical, as you can see here from the photo up the top, Black Panther. This was more militant, and they did call for use of violence if necessary. There was also another movement that was happening simultaneous, and sometimes people confuse these two. Black Power movement is different from the Black Panther movement. The Black Power movement was a separate movement that kind of was about celebration of your African American distinctiveness. It's kind of like a Harlem Renaissance, so to speak, where you take pride in in your African American heritage. So it promoted Afro hairstyles and more traditional African dress, allowing hair to be more natural, all of these kinds of things as an empowerment movement. Um, and as you can see from the bottom picture, what is going to make this radicalness is because it seemed like society continued to be against civil rights movement. For example, this was the 1968 Olympics, and the gold and silver medalists were were African Americans who won. And during the national anthem, they put their fists in the air, which was a sign of black power, right? The pride in your African heritage. And because of that, their medals were taken away, because it was, again, a system that was not embracing of a civil rights, of the civil rights movement. All right. Going along with more violence, Martin Luther King will be killed, assassinated by James Earl Ray in Memphis, Tennessee, at the Lorraine Hotel. And as you can see here, he was shot. I don't know if you can see him down here. He's shot on the balcony, and they're pointing to the assassin who was in a building across the street. As a result of the assassination, riots broke out in U.S. cities. At least 40 were killed. And again, the movement is more violent during this time, but there was slow, quiet progress being made by African Americans in the late 1960s. Voter registration in the South started to increase. There were several hundred African Americans elected to office. First African American mayor is going to be elected in Cleveland and in Gary, Indiana. Integration, about half of all African American kids went to integrated schools. Again, slow progress. All right, so we're going to switch gears, and we're going to still talk about civil rights, but not necessarily African American civil rights. Earl Warren, the guy who wrote the Warren Report that investigated the Kennedy assassination, he was Chief Justice. And under his court, he was considered a more liberal-leaning justice. There's going to be some pretty landmark verdicts on social issues, although controversial, certainly at the time. So one is Engel versus Vital, and this is no forced prayer in public schools. So this is why we don't have prayer in public schools. Reynolds versus Simmons. This was attempting to bring about more equality within legislative districts. They must be equal in population. Freedom of the press was also an issue. New York Times versus Sullivan was the first. It protected First Amendment rights in terms of freedom of the press. And unless there is actual malice, like if something's being published because someone's got a vendetta against someone else. Griswold versus Connecticut is the one I want to spend a little more time with. This is going to be a landmark decision that's going to lay the groundwork for Roe versus Wade. So this is the reason I'm taking a few seconds to talk about this one. The court did strike down a law that prohibited the use of contraceptives. And you may say, wait, contraceptives were prohibited? Yes. It was up to states, and many states did prohibit the use of contraceptives. So Griswold versus Connecticut basically said, no, states, you can't do that. And in the opinion, the majority opinion, the Griswold versus Connecticut basically established the right to privacy. So the ruling was made because Chief Justice Earl Warren said there is an implied right to privacy that was used to justify prohibiting, to end the prohibition of contraceptives. If a married couple wants to use contraceptives, then they have every right to that privacy to use contraceptives. And this implied right to privacy is based on the 4th, 5th, 9th, 10th, and 14th Amendments, that it is implied in those amendments. Now, critics will say that it's an invented right, and others say, well, it's a no-duh kind of thing. So, Griswold versus Connecticut will lay the groundwork for Roe versus Wade. The Warren Court will also be interested in safeguarding the rights of persons accused of a crime. So this is where we have the famous Miranda versus Arizona. We simply call them the Miranda rights. It required police to inform accused persons of their rights. You have a right to remain silent. If you give up that right, anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. and to have an attorney present during questioning. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided to you. Now, for all of those rights to be legit rights, there were other Supreme Court cases that created these Miranda rights. For example, what about if you can't afford an attorney, one will be provided to you? When did that happen? It happened in Gideon versus Wainwright. The court ruled that defendants in serious criminal cases are entitled to legal counsel even if they were too poor to afford it. So we do have the indigent defender program as a result. So that last part of the Miranda warning came because of Gideon versus Wainwright. How about you have a right to attorney and to have an attorney present during questioning? When did that happen? Oh, it happened in Escobedo versus Illinois. It required police to inform an arrested person of the right to remain silent, and that if you are accused of some kind of crime, you have every right to have an attorney present. So this political cartoon, which explains the whole thing, I don't have time to read, but realize that Escobedo, if you have that you have every right to have an attorney present during questioning. All right, so let's just end this now. So the results of the 1968 presidential election, because remember LBJ decided not to run for his second term. So Johnson is going to return back to Texas and dies in 1973. And the Great Society is a failure because Vietnam took money away from the social programs. So all of those things that were being used that did start to help end poverty in the United States was basically robbed by Vietnam. And then, of course, Vietnam was a failure, as we're going to see as the Nixon administration is going to then take up the banner of Vietnam. And we'll talk more about Vietnam in the next video as we move from LBJ to Nixon. By the way, here's the election results of the 1968 election where Nixon will win. Notice we have a third-party candidate that actually got some electoral votes, and that is, of course, former governor of Alabama, George Wallace. He's the segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever candidate. So he took the Deep South vote. Regardless, Nixon will win, and we'll pick up with Nixon on the other side. Stay safe.